So firstly, good afternoon all. I'm Olivia and I'm the Associate School Partnership Manager for the West Midlands and the South West. Here with me today are the rest of my team: Charlotte Haynes, the School Partnership Manager for the West Midlands, Laura Reason, the School Partnership Manager for the South West, and Paul Murphy, who is our Director. So in our last webinar, we focused on how schools and trusts are approaching their professional development and planning. Our next 3 webinars are going to take a closer look at one aspect of this planning. So once you've assessed the need within your school and trust, and you know where the gaps are, how can you go about developing these? Today, we are focusing on leadership, and specifically, what is great leadership and how can we approach leadership development? This webinar is being recorded and we'll share this along with the slides later this week. And we will also share the recording from the last webinar with it, just in case you've missed out on that one. So first, we'll look to explore what leadership in school is and how it is best described by the persistent challenges faced by the people we call leaders. We will then look at the various approaches to leadership development, how they are challenging, and how we can approach developing great leadership in our schools. In defining school leadership, we will start with what we know. We know that there are approximately 200,000 people working within leadership positions within schools in England, and that the majority of these are middle leaders, so people that are still in the classrooms but have extra responsibilities for phases or year groups or pastoral aspects such as behaviour. We also know that the impact of great leaders is second only to the impact of great teaching in impacting the outcome and consequently the life chances of pupils.
And yet, despite the importance placed on school leadership, there's no agreed definition on what a school leader is or does. Rather than a universal definition of leadership, there appears to be several different types of leadership, or rather competing theoretical perspectives of school leadership. A review of studies on educational leadership models reveals how models of leadership developed over 30 years. Almost 1,000 papers were written about 14 different types of leadership between 1980 and 2014. The 3 most written about types of leadership are transformational leadership, instructional leadership, and teacher leadership. To enable us to better support leaders and to make progress in training and development, we need to be able to identify the concept of school leadership. We can do this by better understanding the nature of schools and the persistent problems that leaders deal with. In their leadership blog series, Tom Rees, our Executive Director of School Leadership, and Jen Barker, our Senior Dean of Learning Design, focus on how we can define the work of school leaders by understanding that their actions are usually made in response to a problem or challenge. They also clarify that the word problems obviously has negative connotations and that this is not what they mean. They use Thomas Nichols' definition of problems, which is the demand that a goal be achieved plus constraints on the manner in which it is achieved. In defining leadership by the work school leaders undertake, we move away from other conceptions of leadership, such as personality, persuasion, and influence, and instead focus on the things leaders are working towards and how they achieve them. This does not, however, mean that Tom and Jen are suggesting that the generic skill of problem solving should be focused on to improve leadership. This would fall in with one of the transformational leadership traits that was so widely written about between 1980 and 2014. Transformational leadership focused on the generic skills that all great leaders should have: to be visionary, to be charismatic, and to be inspirational. The kind of problem solving Tom and Jen focus on and define school leadership as requires much less focus on problem solving skills and places the weight on having great amounts of domain-specific knowledge and contextual knowledge.
Generic leadership is essentially the attributes, skills, and knowledge linked to the field of leadership rather than the specific domain that someone is leading. So, for example, traits and characteristics of a leader or leadership practices, such as setting a vision, communication, or, as Laura's touched on, problem-solving skills. These are transferable skills, and this suggests they could be developed and relevant in any organisation, regardless of whether you're managing a corporate company, a football team, or a school. Domain-specific leadership, however, is the knowledge and skills within a specific field, domain, or type of organisation. So a deep knowledge and understanding of the domain that the leader has responsibility for and the context they work in. So in schools, this might be special educational needs, subject specialism, teacher development, or even finance. A focus on the domain-specific knowledge required by school leaders has been quite an unfashionable idea, but it's one that we know needs more prominence in the discourse, particularly when thinking about designing leadership development. Up until very recently, and by very recently I mean since this week, when the first reformed MPQ cohorts start, the most common leadership development in our country, our MPQs, focused on generic leadership skills. Organisations such as ourselves have been focusing on domain-specific leadership development in our programmes for some time now, but the evidence of generic leadership approaches are evident in everything from head teacher adverts to Ofsted reports. Adverts for the superhuman head teacher will often advertise for dynamic and inspirational leaders, and Ofsted will often praise the inspirational and passionate leadership of head teachers. But despite their popularity and the fact that these are obviously good traits, there is limited evidence to suggest that generic leadership skills in themselves are something that can actually be developed in a way that will allow leaders to have a positive impact on pupil attainment. If we take a look at the previous MPQ content, you can see that those studying an MPQ in middle leadership, senior leadership, headship, or exec leadership will all have learnt content organised into the same 6 areas. 5 out of 6 of these could be transferred or applied to any managerial role, with the odd one out obviously being teaching and curriculum excellence, which is of course school specific.
Compare these to the reformed MPQ modules for each area, and you can see that the DfE have placed weight on the domain-specific knowledge leaders need in order to be able to effectively do their jobs and affect change in schools. This change has taken years, but so positive, and we can now be confident that the golden thread of professional development that many of our colleagues will now follow, from ECT to leaders of trusts, will focus on what leaders need to know and do in order to be successful. Organisations such as ourselves build this into the core of all of our programmes, not just the new MPQs. So if we are concluding that the core responsibilities of leadership roles are the best starting point when considering development, how can you go about organising this into a curriculum for leadership development? One of the first steps is to consider the limitations and problems with the concept of domain-specific approach, as this will help when thinking about a development curriculum. In relation to a domain-specific expertise, the term domain refers to a body of knowledge which a leader should become acquainted with. This body of knowledge is associated with their field of practice, but how big is the domain you're thinking about? Education itself is too vague and large a domain to focus on in an entirety, and would also suggest anything from outside of education is not relevant, for example, psychology and sociology. It's perhaps more useful to define discrete fields of practice, such as curriculum leadership, safeguarding, or early years education. These domains certainly have specific knowledge associated with them, but we can also define smaller domains, such as the early years curriculum. When it comes to designing leadership development, there's a challenge in identifying the right grain size of knowledge to be most helpful to leaders. If you break down the practice of a leader into tiny chunks, the curriculum becomes far too long and disorganised. But if you keep chunks too large, they may be too complex for novices. We know that context is important in education. School leaders need local knowledge, so knowledge of the community, knowledge of school culture, and knowledge of their relationships with staff. A curriculum focusing on leadership development should promote the application of domain-specific knowledge in ways which recognise the school's context. Finally, in practice, school leaders are confronted with a range of educational problems which require the application of knowledge and skills as they attend to them. School leaders' expertise is defined by their success in addressing or overcoming these challenges. It's these problems that provide purpose to leaders' work, and as such, it's advisable that these challenges are what domain-specific knowledge must be organised around. In 2016, Mary Kennedy used the term persistent problems when defining teaching. She outlined 5 persistent problems teachers face and then defined teaching in relation to these. Tom Rees and Jen Barker have recently defined 7 persistent problems of leadership. In this diagram, you can see the 7 persistent problems of leadership they identified, along with the 3 things that define a persistent problem. And I'll just give you a few seconds to look over that. This model of organising a curriculum for leadership development remains domain-specific in a way that also deals with the challenges and limitations we just explored. By organising the work of leaders around these 7 problems, we can then explore problems at different levels, nested within these 7 broad categories, so the challenge of what size knowledge chunks to break the curriculum down into is made easier. Also, by identifying the core work of school leaders and the knowledge needed to make this possible, we can avoid being swayed by fads or policy shifts. Rather than starting with initiatives such as assessment for learning, instructional coaching, or knowledge organisers, we begin by asking what core problems need to be attended to. Organising the problems that leaders face and the knowledge needed to solve them in this way means we can effectively structure and sequence leadership development. It focuses development on depictions of practice, not simply on developing formal knowledge, enabling leaders to adapt their behavioural approach to solve problems in a variety of ways and across different contexts. We'll now take a look at how we can help leaders prepare to face the persistent problems of their role.
At Ambition, we view great leadership through the lens of expertise of great leaders. We know that expertise is made, not born. It's a relatively new and sometimes unpopular view of expertise, but we argue that it is not down to traits or to natural skill, but having an inside-out knowledge of something and practice dealing with this or doing this built up over time. But what does underpin expert performance? And if we're saying it can be developed, then how? At Ambition, nearly all of our content in all of our programs is built around supporting educators to build mental models that allow them to deal with the persistent problems of their role. And it is in building these strong mental models that literature suggests is responsible for expertise. Just knowing things, so formal knowledge, does not equal expertise. Knowledge needs to be organised in a way that allows it to address problems. A mental model is the knowledge an individual holds and how it's organised to guide action. They are representations people hold about the range of things they do, underpinned by knowledge, developed through instruction, experience, and practice and feedback. So if we think about great or expert school leadership through the lens of everything we've addressed today, we'd summarise it as an understanding of the persistent problems, knowledge relating to these problems and the context they exist within, progressively built upon and acted upon over time, that result in behaviour changes as these develop into strong mental models. The key behaviour changes we expect to see as people develop strong mental models would be the ability to solve problems in less time or with less effort. So that is summarised as intuition. And being able to spot where a problem is either similar to one that's been dealt with previously or to recognise where a situation poses a new challenge. And that's summarised as improved pattern recognition. Central to developing effective professional development, therefore, is to consider the codification of leaders' knowledge, which is how we can understand it and arrange it into a structure that makes it easier to access, to understand and to talk about. A really relevant example of this is the new Early Careers Framework, which codifies the knowledge that ECTs need, so that series of learn that and learn how to statements. We've then been able to design our curriculum for the ECT programme from this codified knowledge. To try and codify the knowledge that school leaders require is obviously a much more complex task, because as well as needing all of the same knowledge that those ECTs need, so things rooted in teaching, there's also additional knowledge that leaders of course benefit from having because their role is much more multifaceted. At this stage, we should address that formal knowledge, so textbook knowledge, is also not the only kind of knowledge we're trying to codify when we design PD for leaders. This slide summarises the 4 categories of knowledge that in experts are usually developed to a really high degree. So I'll just give you a minute to read that. So professional development for school leaders must still involve access to those rich sources of formal knowledge, the textbook knowledge, but alongside significant amounts of experience of the work. So leaders should have opportunities to make sense of that formal knowledge, to put it into practice in their own contexts, and then to receive expert feedback on what they've learned. Of course, the knowledge held and required by individuals will vary depending on what level of leadership they're at and like their remit and their context. But generally speaking, to develop expertise, they will require knowledge from the 4 categories outlined in this slide.
But we know all CPD is only 5 to 10% effective in having an impact, and we are working towards developing the most effective CPD possible. Alongside a focus on what school leaders should learn as part of their professional development, it's also important to consider how, through programme design, learning should be structured and sequenced. But designing effective PD is challenging. The work teachers and leaders do is complex, and the circumstances within which they work are hectic and challenging. And so making the time consistently to prioritise personal development can be incredibly hard. To address this challenge, we can draw on some key insights, including what we know about how humans learn, alongside recent research into the mechanisms or active ingredients that underpin successful professional development. We should also pay attention to the conditions in which professional development takes place, acknowledging the limited time and attention that school leaders have to engage in professional development. Finally, we should ensure that professional development links to the priority problems that leaders are addressing in their schools, so that we can ensure it tackles what's most important for the school and builds coherence in the work of the wider school staff. So any PD should build on and enhance current work and policies rather than adding on extra work, for example, the old MPQ projects. So let's return to how we approach PD design here and how you can approach and support leadership development within your schools and trusts. Looking at the mechanisms of successful PD, rather than the characteristics or form of it, gives us more insight into what is actually causing the behaviour change we want to see within professional development. You can see on the screen the 14 mechanisms identified in a recent EEF report as the most likely to be effective and grouped by purpose. For example, instructional coaching is a form of PD and can be delivered in different ways, such as the opportunity to work weekly with a senior or peer colleague. This would be a characteristic of instructional coaching. But the mechanism that often makes instructional coaching effective is the specific active modelling and feeding back and creating cues. And this is what's important to focus on when designing PD. The report tells us that professional development containing at least one mechanism from each category is 3 times more likely to have an impact on pupil standardised test scores. This is what we call a balanced delivery, and we incorporate this into all of our programmes with several mechanisms built into each programme's delivery. School leaders, like teachers and students, are subject to many common challenges when it comes to learning: motivation, distraction, forgetting and transfer. Therefore, we apply the same evidence-based approach we do when thinking about how children learn to our programmes. For example, managing individuals' cognitive load and ensuring opportunities for retrieval practice. We consider this to be so relevant to teaching that we dedicate a module to it in our Masters in Expert Teaching programme, and there's no reason that this should be different when considering how adults learn. Because of this, all of our programmes of professional development are designed and sequenced in such a way that means leaders are introduced to concepts which they continually revisit, alongside the use of techniques such as low-stakes quizzing, which make it more likely that knowledge is retained over time. The addition of opportunities for this knowledge to be applied in a school context, alongside carefully curated opportunities for practice and feedback, gives the highest chance that relevant information will be retained and embedded into practice. For example, our new leadership MPQs have insight modules in which participants engage with and retrieve new information, and application modules in which participants get a chance to practice the new thinking in their context. Each weekly module begins by revisiting the last topic for 10 minutes, a small step that we know means the learning is more likely to be embedded, and this results in behaviour change.
The conditions in a school can lead to any CPD-related activity being viewed as either developmental or threatening, depending on how they're experienced. Professional development will be most effective in a school culture where participating individuals feel supported, valued and trusted, where the purpose of their PD is clear and aligns with their individual goals, and where the school have thought carefully about how to protect the time needed to engage in professional development. An example of this is ensuring that professional development is designed in such a way that it fits around school timetables. So individuals working in schools have lots of responsibilities they need to maintain, whether they're teaching or not. And so the incorporation of content which can be completed flexibly and at a time that suits the participant is one way of overcoming this challenge. So again, using our MPQs as an example, we've increased the proportion of online modules so that participants can access them at a time which suits them, rather than relying on face-to-face events at fixed times. So for example, the leadership MPQs only has 2 conferences that are face-to-face throughout the entire programme. Everything else is either asynchronous or remote. So just really trying to protect the time that leaders have to do their daily activities that they still need to complete and their professional development time. Evidence suggests that more effective leaders develop staff consensus around clear pedagogical goals and priorities. Professional development has also been found to be more effective when it's selected on the basis that it relates to and enhances individuals' work and individuals' ability to address identified priorities. Supporting staff to engage in professional development, which can be clearly connected to their current priorities, is therefore obviously really important. A great example of this, again using one of our programmes, is our Teacher Education Fellows course. It's a 2-year programme designed to help teacher educators develop informed and intentional approaches to the most important components of teacher education. The programme focuses on the building blocks of what teachers should learn, how training works and how teachers can be influenced, and it supports participants to apply what they learn to improve teaching and learning in their school. The entire second year of that programme sees participants design and implement a project to influence teaching across their school. The project supports participants to identify what their school needs most and how to achieve it through designing and delivering personal development. That is essentially what the role of someone in charge of all that CPD and teacher education within a school would be. So rather than giving them a sort of bolt on to their work, the second year is entirely based around supporting them to do their job and to do it really effectively with the support of their peers and their facilitators throughout the programme. There's also examples of it within our new MPQs. We've designed community sessions, which are focused on personal challenges a participants facing. So we carefully crafted this sequence that was underpinned by research from medical rounds, where a challenge is unpicked and explored through peer questioning, challenge and advice. So by rooting professional development conversations around their own personal challenges, ensures that it closely connects to the priorities of individuals' needs so they can respond to them in their school. Having considered how we can design excellent PD and having touched on how you can support with creating the conditions for PD to be effective in your schools, it's important to consider how you plan pathways for yourselves and your staff. As we highlighted in our previous webinar, and if you weren't able to attend, we will be sharing the recording, the importance of gathering data and insight at an individual level to support the choice of professional development you deploy is a really important aspect to focus on in terms of your long-term planning and knowing where the gaps are across your school or schools. We've highlighted potential pathways for teachers, teacher educators and leaders here at Ambition, as well as sort of whole school and whole trust reform approaches, but these will be most beneficial and supportive if you're able to identify your need and really pick out the programmes that will be effective. But designing this approach to PD does take time, and it's a very new concept. So to try and support this shorter term, we've taken a look at how our reformed MPQs and our wider leadership support offer address the persistent problems of leadership as you start to think about developing domain-specific knowledge within your schools. So here at Ambition, we split our programmes into breadth and depth programmes. Breadth programmes cover multiple leadership areas. So the work of senior leaders, for example, is very complex and multifaceted. And so it's really helpful for senior leaders to have a sort of well-rounded view of school leadership beyond just their area of responsibility and a clear understanding of how the different areas of school leadership interact with one another. So again, if we take the reformed MPQs as an example, they cover a really wide range of leadership areas covered by the leadership frameworks, everything from teaching right through to organisational management, and they provide the opportunity for leaders to fill any knowledge gaps that might have arisen during their career, and it also helps them think about progressing into more senior and strategic roles. Our Trust Leaders programme is another example. It's a tailor-made programme for current or aspiring CEOs to develop the skills they need to build and lead a sustainable organisation. So again, because of that, you can see that it covers lots of the persistent problems of leadership identified by Jen and Tom. Our depth courses, however, focus on specialist areas within a leader's role. And whilst they can still offer a whole organisational impact, they tend to cover one area in great detail. So taking our curriculum for senior leaders programme, we know that there's a persistent challenge within the persistent problem of curriculum in tying together the intent, implementation and impact of curriculum, and also in enabling conditions for curriculum design. So getting all of your subject leads working together to ensure that subject curriculums are interwoven. So we've been able to support through this by designing a programme that helps senior leaders set a vision for, enable conditions for, and implement a really high quality curriculum. Our specialist focus for professional development comes in an easily mapped offer that supports whole school change when you're thinking about developing culture and school improvement, again, two of the persistent problems identified. The new specialist MPQ for leading teacher development, for example, supports those leading the development of teachers, with those then responsible for driving wider CPD, able to develop the skills to do this through our Teacher Education Fellows course. So you can see how, rather than starting with something such as instructional coaching and building a programme out from that, which is a very common way that schools approach things, we've instead really started with the persistent problems and built out from those when designing our programmes. Each of these programmes are then rooted in the evidence we've discussed today and support leaders to develop those strong mental models around the persistent problems they face in their role. This has been a very sort of whistle-stop tour of how we approach leadership development and how we think it can be approached in schools. But we'd be really happy to speak to you about it in more detail and in a way where we can apply it to your context and your priorities. So whether it's how you approach professional development planning, the specific leadership pathways in your school, or even just something about how you can create a school culture that fosters development, we'd be really happy to talk to you. I manage the West Midlands and Laura manages the South West. So our emails are on there if you did want to speak to us. Between now and January, we'll be taking a closer look at great teaching and great teacher education. By teacher education, we mean like those in charge of teaching the teachers. So anyone in charge of CPD or mentoring. We'll be circulating dates and registration links close to the time within the next couple of weeks, so keep an eye out for those. But for now, we can move on to any questions.